take two.
There we go.
Okay, so I'd like to introduce Larry Bergreen. Larry's a prize-winning biographer, historian, and chronicler of exploration. Among his books are biographies of Christopher Columbus, Marco Polo, Magellan, Casanova, Louis Armstrong, Al Capone, and Irving Berlin, which have been translated into 25 languages worldwide. Larry's book, Columbus, The Four Voyages, was a New York Times bestseller, selected for Book of the Month Club, the History Book Club, and the Military Book Club, and for the New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice. He's written on many national publications, including the Wall Street Journal, Esquire, and Newsweek, the Chicago Tribune. Larry taught at the New School for Social Research and served as assistant to the president of the Museum of Television and Radio in New York. He's a member of Penn American Center, and he's a trustee of the New York Society Library. He graduated from Harvard in 1972 and lives in New York. And tonight, Larry will be discussing, for our benefit, exploration is a spiritual quest. So there'll be a talk and then a question and answer period. So Larry, thank you so much for joining us. We're absolutely delighted to have you here.
Well, thanks for having me. And this looks like a really great group. I've never really talked about these books from the perspective of them as a spiritual quest. It's always been apparent to me, let alone to the explorers themselves. So I think this is a great approach. I'll try to do it justice. And anyway, if I can just pique your curiosity a little bit to look at the actual documents and explorers, I think that'll be worthwhile. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the books, but feel free to jump in at any time and say, you can't hear me, I'm speaking too fast. What did I mean by that? And anything else that occurs to you. And then at the end of, well, I have a little, 25 minutes or so, I'll kind of wrap up my remarks, and then the more discussion, the merrier, as far as I'm concerned. So I'd like to focus on a few of the books that are connected, Marco Polo, and then Magellan, Columbus, and Francis Drake, which is the most recent one. The Drake book was published just last year, and in fact recently came out in paperback. So that's the most recent project that kind of tided me over during this pandemic. This kind of phenomenon, by the way, is something that all these explorers were exposed to, and much worse, much more serious all the time. And it was for them, disaster was their sort of operating environment, their sheer courage, and you could even say foolhardiness was really extraordinary. And you would say, well, why them? And why did they do it? And I would have to say, in each case, well, there were two reasons, but the primary reason, if you ask them, they would say because it was some sort of divinely inspired mission or expedition, that a higher power wanted them to do this and to succeed. This becomes really explicit with Columbus, who writes about talking to God and the voice of God. Today, that would be seen as a sign of some sort of psychological aberration. In Columbus's era, a lot of people thought they spoke to God and God spoke back to them. So it wasn't that unusual. But in Columbus, his sense of divine guidance was particularly acute, which I'll try to show. I also think these are great adventure stories as well as spiritual stories. But there was a sense of going through an ordeal and coming out, if they survived, the better for it. And I'll begin with Marco Polo. This was an entire book that I wrote, which, it's not even clear that Marco Polo actually existed or who he was. There are Marco Polo documents There's a whole account of that I drew heavily on about his travels through what he called India or China. But we don't really know. It was not written down by him. We do know that there was a Polo family from Venice, and they were merchants. And in the late 13th century, they, like other merchants, went to the East to trade in spices and other precious things. What was unusual was it was overland, so it was very slow. A round trip for these merchants of Venice could take 20 or 30 years or even longer. So these were long-term projects. And Marco Polo went with his father and his grandfather, maybe some other relatives, so far as we know, left Venice and came back years later. He left as a teenager and came back, of course, as an adult, really a middle-aged adult, and very much of a changed person. He did not go to begin with because any kind of spiritual mission was in the offing, or because he felt that a divine voice told him to. They went for commercial purposes. Venice was a trading city and a trading economy, and that's what they did. However, for Marco Polo, and what made it unusual was to get a sense of his evolution. The reason that we know about it was through a quirk of fate when he got back to Venice years later. And I'm going to be sort of inexact about dates because no one knows for sure, but when he did finally return, he was thrown into jail. And he was, it was now the end of the 1298, end of the 13th century. As it happened, one of his, and I would say jail, this is a VIP jail. He was not having bread and water. It was perhaps more like detained in a some sort of dormitory or palace. Was an Italian poet, not a very good one, and he heard Marco Polo's stories and thought they were incredible, and decided, oh, this would be terrific. And he decided to weave them together. And that's how we know about Marco Polo, not in his own words, but in the words of Rustichello of Pisa. And occasionally he interjects himself to show that he is the one who's controlling this narrative, but he is purporting to be talking about Marco Polo. Could he have been making this up? Yes, it's possible. Is it possible that Marco Polo never even went to China? There are a number of books that explain why that couldn't be possible. And yet, scholars have found evidence that Marco Polo was in China, of the identity that he assumed there, and of the role that he played there. He really went for commercial purposes, as I mentioned, and later on met the Kublai Khan and became a census taker and tax collector. That's not as strange as it sounds, because in those days, the Mongols employed foreigners for jobs like this because they felt they were more trustworthy. So Marco Polo diligently went around large parts of the Mongol Empire, describing what he saw. Now, again, what makes it different or difficult for us is that his conception of the world is different from ours. He felt that the planets and the sun all revolved around the Earth. He was unaware of large parts of the Earth. All these explorers, until Magellan, were unaware of the existence of the Pacific Ocean, which is the largest body of water on the planet. Marco went mostly overland and brought back very valuable stories about his travels. most of which have been verified by other accounts, other travelers. They're not made up, but it's possible that there was some fiction involved, and it's very difficult to check. Well, anyway, I did the best I could to give a sense of what he was like. What I felt was interesting in this book, and which I hadn't noticed before in other books, was Marco's own evolution as he came of age. Of course, he left Venice as a Christian, but he was never a particularly spiritual person. But when he was, it seemed like he was going to be at large in the Mongol Empire indefinitely, he began to take on characteristics or be influenced by the spiritual climate around him. And I'm not sure what we would call it now. Would we call it Buddhist? Would we call it something else? But he makes a reference to the fact that he was losing his the meaning, the value, the immediacy of the tenets of Christianity, which he had learned by rote as a child, and was seeing things in a different way, without limits, in a non-doctrinaire way, and a different way of seeing things. To my way of thinking, this is what makes Marco Polo different from any other merchant of Venice who went to China. And there were a bunch of others who went. Not all of them, even some of them rather, wrote accounts, but they didn't have this sense of a kind of a luminosity, of a spiritual awareness that animates his account and makes it very vivid and believable. It's in a way that's oversimplifying things, because Marco wasn't really telling a chronology or relating a chronology of his travels. It was more like a diary or an account of highlights. He had went through several places, different times, for example, Beijing, and other cities. And it was a compilation of his impressions. So it was impressionistic. It was, quite articulate, but we all see it through the lens of Rustichello. Marco was probably perfectly capable of writing this himself, but it was Rustichello who had the good luck, I guess, to be the one to conduct this debriefing, this extensive debriefing of Marco. And again, we don't really have any kind of definitive text about it. There are lots of different versions. Well, I say lots, several different versions of what Rustichello purportedly wrote. Some are longer and some are shorter. I tried to work off the longest, most complete one, which was filled with contradictions and repetitions, but to me seemed the most complete. I was trying to compress some of those. So there was a lot of reshaping on my part as well. So I was hoping that I could somehow keep the narrative coherent and grounded in reality to a certain extent, and yet keep it truthful to Marco's own experience, because I got this sense that the further he went, the older he became, the more his journey became one through a spiritual medium rather than just geography. If you've ever been to Mongolia, and I have, because I was trying to retrace some of Marco's footsteps, you're immediately aware of a kind of a spiritual aspect to it, because it's so empty, it's so vast. You think there's nothing there. These are just my subjective impressions, and yet there's everything there. And there's a much different sense of how people relate to each other, completely different from what we take for granted here in the West, and then and now. There's no sense of private property. This is not just personal possessions, but also extends to land. This was a nomadic culture in Mongolia. The Mongolians whom Marco visited had one encampment in a northern area when the weather was warm, and then when it got colder, they moved south, and they went back and forth every single year. They counted their wealth in their livestock. They didn't own things in the sense that we would think they did, and it was a very different kind of a culture. So and really unique, very tenacious, and persists to this day in certain ways. I, as a personal note, and then we're going to move on now. When I was there, when you go to Mongolia, and maybe some of you have been there, you usually fly into the capital, Ulaanbaatar. And here you see the worst, I thought, the worst of the West. If you had never been in the West and all you saw was the trash, trashy movies, trashy stores, trashy culture, and Ulaanbaatar, you wouldn't want to go to the West because it seems very unappealing. But as soon as you get out of the city, it's really different. And I don't want to describe Mongolians today as being some sort of primitive people. They aren't. They're highly sophisticated. They're highly intelligent. By coincidence, a couple of weeks after I got back to New York, there was a UN conference. And some of the Mongolians whom I met there were here in New York at the UN for their first time ever in New York. But it was a different experience because they came dressed in their kaftans, which is what they were used to. It's like us going somewhere and going in our khakis or our blue jeans. And I still remember standing on the street in Midtown and greeting several of them. And this was not a handshake. This was not a greeting. Nice to see you. This was a big, big bear hug that went on and on and on, because that was a typical Mongolian greeting. And I remember people on this, sidewalk staring at us. And well, anyway, that's, what can I say? It's New York. So anyway, it was a different kind of a culture. And some of these Mongolians, I still email and I'm in touch with right up until, I don't know, 2 days ago. And I will continue to be so because, their sense of time and space, as I'm hinting in a very kind of a crude way, is really different from ours. And anyway, okay, so Marco Polo travels became legendary around Europe and Rusticello's telling. And it was seen partly as a book of wonders and partly as a jumping off point or inspiration for other travels. After a while, other people wanted to see, not so much to emulate what Marco Polo did, but to see if they could get to China over water. So that was the big impetus. Why over water? Because they thought it would be faster, because they didn't know about the Pacific Ocean. And as it turned out, the Pacific, of course, is the largest body of water on the planet and contains 2/3 of the water to be found anywhere on the planet. But these early explorers didn't know about it. And they, well, I guess they learned eventually. When people say, oh, Columbus thought he was going to China, by which they meant India, that's actually literally true. He made 4 voyages, which I wrote about in my book, between 1492 and 1504 in a 12-year span. Each time he thought he was going to China. And he thought he was, if not there, on the outskirts. So why did Columbus go? Well, if you read the newspapers today, you would say, well, he went to slaughter, the indigenous people there, and maybe exploit them, and it went downhill from there. Well, I mean, that it's not as simple as that. He went because he was on a spiritual quest. He told himself he was going to spread Christianity to other lands and other countries to bring them Christianity, and that was his plan. Well, how did things go wrong? It kind of depends who you ask. It was partly because the longer he was there, more the commercial instincts took over. And he was from Genoa in Italy. Genoese culture had a tradition of exploitation and slavery, all of which he brought with him. So his mindset was one that was particularly would strike us as being unusual and cruel, but he was not a monster or cruel by the standards of his era. He was, in a sense, conventional. He represented conventional thinking of his time. The fact that he went 4 times and still couldn't figure out the geography of the globe shows partly that he couldn't get it through his own thick skull because he was very stubborn, and partly because of limitations of European knowledge of geography at that point. But in his moments of distress, what I thought was interesting about Columbus was the fact that he felt he heard the voice of God speaking to him. There was a particularly dramatic moment where he was in a big storm and he thought his, all was lost. And he wrote down what he thought God said to him, which were comforting words. This was not because he was, irrational, if he would say, or thought of himself as a mystic. It's because he felt that he could, if you will, tune into a higher frequency, as well as being very precise and disciplined and calculating. Columbus was a masterful navigator rather. And one of the fact that he could make 4 voyages back and forth across the Atlantic in a relatively short amount of time with relatively little loss of life, and nobody else was doing it at that point, was extraordinary. So that, testifies to the best of Columbus, and gave him some confirmation that he was fulfilling a mission. There are some interpretations of Columbus that are even messianic, that he felt, he's even beyond what he claimed for himself in his, most uninhibited flights of his imagination. Keep in mind that there was another side of him that was much more self-seeking. He wanted to get rich. He was looking for gold. He was not above enslaving the indigenous peoples, the Taino and others whom he encountered, to help him in this. He was appalled by some of the side effects or unintended effects of his voyages. Most of these explorations can be seen as examples of unintended consequences. In Columbus's case, it's not only the infections and diseases that we know about, but it was the sense that he committed some sort of genocide. I don't think Columbus, there's no evidence that Columbus or his brother who sailed with him said, okay, well, let's go and we're going to sail to the New World, because he didn't use that word because he thought he was going to the Old World, which was China, and kill a lot of people. That happened. When he finally got to the Caribbean, we're not sure exactly where, he was astonished by the fact that so many of the indigenous peoples whom he was dealing with were poisoning themselves with poison herbs or jumping off of cliffs by the thousands. And he wrote about this. He was appalled. He didn't know what to do about it, and he didn't know what his role was in it, if any. In fact, it was a key role, because he was seen by them as a fulfillment of an evil prophecy, a doomsday prophecy, if you will, that when ships came over the horizon, their world would end. So that's why he triggered inadvertently this mass self-extinction, which was, very perplexing to him, and he, didn't know what to make of it, and it was beyond his comprehension. Uh, Anyway, I don't think Columbus would have made these voyages without the sense that he was in some way fulfilling or trying to fulfill a divinely inspired mission. And keep in mind that, we now, there's a movement to say no more Columbus. We're not going to mention anymore. It's going to be indigenous peoples. We're going to take down Columbus statues everywhere we find them. And Columbus himself would have been flabbergasted if he came back today to see what has gone on in his name, because first of all, he never knew North America existed. And all these cities and streets and monuments that were named for him, it would have been astonishing to him that this would have happened, because he thought he was going to China, and he never even set foot, even in Florida. He never even saw Florida. There's some hint that he may have seen, some islands off the coast of Florida, but he never set foot in North America, and as I said, didn't know it existed. So talk about the accidents of history. This is quite an example of one, and yet he has now come to be seen as the person who discovered America, and now sort of the anti-figure as well. Anyway, after Columbus's last voyage in 1504, nothing happened for a long time, because it seemed that if he had proved anything, it was that it was too dangerous to try and traverse the Atlantic. And it was going to take a while before somebody came along and tried to do what he couldn't do, which was go further all the way to China. And this was Ferdinand Magellan, who was Portuguese, and but sailed for Spain. For the King of Spain, and he again had a sense of rapacious commercial impulse and a spiritual mission. Part of his mission was to bring the message of Christianity to parts of the world where it wasn't known. And he was certainly incredibly courageous, if nothing else, and you could say incredibly foolish as well. As you know, he sailed, almost all the way around the world, or a good part of the way around the world, and perished in the Philippines when he got drawn into a war with the inhabitants there completely unnecessarily. But he was the first European, or one of the first, to go all the way through what we now call the Strait of Magellan, and emerge on the Pacific side and realize how large the Pacific was. At that point, the conventional thinking and Magellan's thinking was that it would take a few days, maybe a few weeks to traverse it. So we had no idea that thousands, depending on what you consider the other side of the Pacific was, but thousands of miles of open water lay ahead of him. And again, his only fallback to have courage to undertake this superhuman mission in his 3 little ships that were left him at that point was to invoke the power, a higher power, and which he did over and over. He went through a lot of suffering, of thirst, of hunger, And yet there were some things that seemed to him to be divinely suggested there was divine help. Where often he was surrounded by flying fish, and they would land on the decks of his ships. And therefore, he and his men, the sailors, there were about 60 of them, automatically had some food. They had something to eat, and they didn't starve. This made a huge difference, because one thing they didn't do was bump into any islands, because there weren't any around. The other thing was that he inadvertently discovered something that we take for granted, which is the trade winds that blow steadily across the Pacific, and which gave him a boost all the way across. So between the flying fish and the trades, he had at least some of the requirements for survival. As I mentioned, he never he never made it all the way around himself. A few survivors did limp back to Seville 3 years after they left. That Seville was their port of departure, but there were just about 18 of them, and they had quite a story to tell. And again, to keeping in mind the sense of faith that was so strong at that point. If you want people to make an analogy, oh, it's like astronauts coming back, and they would get a ticker tape parade, and they would get all sorts of benefits from doing this. No, it wasn't like that at all. The few who came back were afraid of being tried for their sins while they were away. And because they happened to come back by coincidence at Easter time, which is in Spain at that now and then, a very somber time. It's not a time of penance. They did acts of penance, not token ones. They walked on bloody knees for miles as penance. And when they were done, they did not expect to get any great benefits from the King of Spain, from King Charles. They just disappeared into their lives. A few of them went out to sea again. Sebastian Elcano, who was a Basque mariner who took over for Magellan, was perhaps the best known. But they were not regarded as heroes or anything like that in that time. Neither was Magellan. It took a long time for the reckoning of history to begin to see Magellan in the way that you could say his proper place, or the way that we see him now. Right. So after Magellan's voyage concluded, again, it seemed to demonstrate that the idea of circumnavigation, for any reason, whether it was for trade purposes, political purposes, or spiritual purposes, was too dangerous to be practical. But then Francis Drake came along. Drake was, again, the subject of my most recent book. And Drake had the benefit of learning from Magellan's mistakes. He was a different kind of a person. He was not as mystic. His father, importantly, his father was a clergyman, and he was very religious. However, he was also what we would call a pirate. He was a buccaneer. He had a mischievous gleam in his eye. I don't think anybody would ever have said that about Magellan in a million years. And he went both for the sake of his own personal aggrandizement, because he hoped to keep a portion of whatever he found, and to, in some way, support Queen Elizabeth I, who was England at that point was an afterthought. It was a small, considered almost a failed state. Elizabeth, people were not taking her seriously at that point, and his goal was to bring back some gold so that the country could stay solvent. Well, where was he going to get gold from? His way of doing it, this was not a mystical gold from El Dorado. was to steal it from the Spaniards, who had been taking gold out of Central America for years. And he would simply sail up and find their encampments. Either they were there or not. And if they were not, so much the better. Load up with gold and sail away, sometimes with spices as well. But Drake preferred gold to spices. He did this with a certain amount of flair, because he had a sense of playfulness. He established a sense of rapport with the Spanish officers whom he encountered, and his devil-may-care point of view was something really unique in the chronicles of exploration up until that point. When he finally got back to England, and he did make it all the way back, he, did receive the kind of reward that he expected, that had eluded Magellan and others like him. But by that point, history was almost beginning to pass him by. And although he had a sense of patriotism, if you will, or doing things for the greater glory of England, there wasn't this sense of spiritual, overarching spiritual mission that had informed Magellan or others. In that sense, Drake is a more modern figure, and very his sense of irony and greed, strike us as being particularly modern. He did and occasionally have some spiritual moments, but they were not that as important to him as this sense of a sense of adventure, and that he knew how to do this, and that he could build on the experiences of Columbus and others. Of course, the whole framework of exploration changed drastically, and this is just jumping ahead for a second, in the 18th century, which became, the age of the Enlightenment, the age of reason, because for the first time, you had voyages that were primarily or in large part for science. This concept didn't exist. There was incidental science for Drake or Magellan or others. But when we get to Captain Cook and others, the fact that they were actually going to increase knowledge, to learn about the world or about people for ostensibly peaceful purposes, that was really something new. Perhaps the most important was Darwin's voyage of the Beagle, which came much later, but that was a totally different mindset from these early, people. And I think the most important thing to keep in mind is how different their world was from ours, how different their mindsets were from ours. And it's very difficult to judge them by our standards. That's not to say we should excuse them, but they really lived in a different time and place. And for me, that was some of the most interesting part of this vicariously voyaging along with them, was to try and see the world through their eyes. Well, how do you do that? I think I had mentioned Rusticello's account with Marco Polo, but we can all do it very easily, because Columbus wrote accounts of his voyages. Drake fortunately brought along a diarist named Antonio Pigafetta, who was a Venetian diplomat, who wrote in a stirring account called First Voyage Around the World, which is really interesting because it's narrated with an almost as it happened immediacy. In other words, he didn't write about this years later. It wasn't as told to. It was a diary that he put into a narrative. So, it's very dramatic. I think this in a way goes double for Columbus, because both Columbus and others, and Columbus was a pretty good writer, and he certainly did like to write a lot, and he was a big self-publicist, leave vivid eyewitness accounts of their experiences. And the eyewitness part was so important because it gives you a window on a different era. And they're time machines. Once you read their words, it's not the same as reading the words of a distinguished historian like Samuel Eliot Morison or any one of number Spanish language ones, because you see it through their own eyes, which I really think is remarkable. There was one missing gap, and I don't know how we're doing time-wise, but if I have a few more minutes in this, and it's a very important one. All these accounts I've been telling you about, we see through Western eyes. We don't hear about them, and it's in a way really hard to guess at what the experiences were of the indigenous peoples whom they encountered, because they didn't have written language. And we can infer what they thought. Certainly Columbus and others did that, but we really don't know. Imagine if some of these people could have written about what it was like when Magellan or Columbus or Marco Polo. Well, it's different in Marco Polo because he did show up in some Chinese annals, but when they showed up, what they thought of these encounters. We can try and imagine what they were thinking, and to some extent their actions do give a sense of what their thoughts and beliefs were. But it's a giant mystery in some ways, and I think it makes it really fascinating. I don't think there's any way to ever really solve it, because I don't think there's going to be any hidden texts that will come to light about because these people were in general pre-literate, and it makes a really big difference. There's a scene that Pigafetta writes about where he was showing one of the indigenous people whom he came across writing. And the person he was showing it to was wondering, what was this? What were these marks on paper? And he was describing the fact that these were words, and the words describe concepts or things, or the sun or the moon. And it was an astonishing moment. And in some ways, that was, I felt, a kind of a key to the whole enterprise of these accounts, was that the written word, and without it, we would have no um, reliable record. And even now, of course, it's partial, it's open to interpretation, translation, and also corruption and all sorts of things. But it's all we have. And in some cases, we don't even have that. So anyway, that gives you some sense of, I don't know, the spiritual sense of what exploration is like. I think, other explorers in space and climbing mountains and going undersea have felt this also. But I'm just talking about some of the people whom I wrote about. And if you have any comments, questions, criticisms, let's go. Anything?
Yeah, Larry, this
Yes.
is Tully. I'll jump in there. Your talk brought a lot of things to mind, both personal and I thought more and more broadly things that are more modern in the way of exploration. But one of the phrases I keyed into that you used was unintended consequences, because I started to think about my own geographic exploration or travels when I was 21 years old and spent 2 years in Hong Kong and Asia. And through these were not intended consequences, but through experiences with a feng shui master in Hong Kong, and through what I saw of the Tibetan refugee community in Darjeeling, India, that has shaped my life going forward. It's one of the reasons I'm here, was seeing that Tibetan community in Darjeeling and being totally taken with it. So there's something about getting out of your own geographic area that can
Yes.
really change you. You mentioned Marco Polo and Mongolia and just the emptiness, the vastness of the space and how that may have shifted him from being Christian to maybe something else. I certainly got shifted from my own experiences there. And then I started to think about what's happened over those, say, the last century in exploration. Has that changed anybody? And
Yes.
you mentioned space travel, and I was thinking about that picture of Earth that the astronauts who went to the moon took, that had us all feel about how beautiful and
Yes.
yet fragile our planet is, and how
Yes.
that may have inspired at least some portion of the environmental movement. And I thought about astronaut Edgar Mitchell sort of secretly going up there and running his psychic experiments
Yeah.
while he was on the moon. So it's not just these old guys,
Right.
Columbus and Marco Polo, but there are modern versions of it also, including myself. I think that's mine. So thank you. I don't know. It brought a lot of things to mind. So thank you for your talk there.
Thank you for your comments. Fascinating. Thank you. Anybody else?
Hi, I'm Valerie. You're
How are you? Hi.
Hi, thank you so much, Laurence. I'm fascinated. And it sounds like very exciting and rewarding work that you've done. If you could, or if you are currently writing about a modern day explorer, who would that be?
A current explorer. I did write another book that was much more contemporary, about 20 years ago, called Voyage to Mars, which was about NASA's exploration of Mars, mostly robotic, but some, speculation about sending people to Mars, which is very much what we're reading about today. And I, found that endlessly fascinating. And, NASA is an absolute avalanche. It's a fire hose of information that you can get online and other ways. So there's so much that you can pick up from NASA just by logging onto I think it's thousands of different NASA websites. I'm currently working on a book, which actually, when I finished this Drake book, I was actually thinking that, I had written a dozen books and it was kind of enough. And I was going to do something different. However, there was one other idea I just couldn't quite let go of, and I'm just working on it now. Because it was about Jules Verne and the invention of the future. In this country, in the United States, we think of Jules Verne as a kind of a adolescent boy's own story, rocket ships. However, in other countries, across Europe, he is seen as a visionary, imagining technology shortly before it existed. And he was extremely influential. I kept hearing about him wherever I went at NASA because I have a lot of connections and friends there. Among historians over and over. So it wasn't just other science fiction writers who came later who said, oh, yes, I was inspired by Jules Verne. That would be, say, Ray Bradbury or somebody like that, or H.G. Wells. Many scientists running the gamut from Robert Goddard, who was considered the father of American rocket science, to Wernher von Braun, the German rocket scientists. So they all trace their roots back to, or their initial inspiration and exploration to Jules Verne. That included Russian cosmonauts like Yuri Gagarin and others. They said, oh, how'd you get interested in space? They were asked the same kind of questions that American astronauts were asked. They said, well, actually, was their first exposure to Jules Verne, who's been translated around the world. So I was curious about, what it was about Jules Verne. I went back for a second look and a third look to see what was so visionary and inspiring about him. So that's what I'm working on now.
Thank you. Thank you. Look
Thanks.
forward to it.
Anything else?
Okay, David?
Yeah, what crossed my mind was that before these voyages that you've been talking about, the idea of a voyage was always connected to an epic event.
Hmm.
One thinks about the Greek epics or the Roman ones, or for that matter, at the time that Marco Polo was trekking, Dante happened to be writing the Divine Comedy, which in its own way is a voyage.
Yes.
And that notion of travel and movement is always tied up with the idea of being lost. You know, you travel because you're lost.
Yes.
And I can't imagine the numbers of times that any of those transatlantic voyagers must have suffered under tremendous sense of being completely lost. You know,
Yes.
as even
Yes.
as skillful as they were in navigation, or we hear about the native peoples who had such an incredible connection to the stars and to the wave movements, who traveled eastward towards South America.
Yes.
You know, the log voyages and so forth, which are in their own way more astonishing than anything that the Europeans did.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
and that you have a sense there of really some kind of supra-rational connection that is making all of this possible, and which is conceivably also present in the very impulse to do that kind of voyaging.
Yes.
You know, and the way you describe your subjects and so forth is that they really were motivated by much more, what should we say, materialistic and very economic. And, you know, was there a complete absence of that sense of the despair of what it was like in the 14th century, 15th century in Spain, for example? You know, the socioeconomic and the political and the other relationships there, which somehow seeped into what those men were doing, aside from the purely utilitarian and self-seeking and economic notions of their motives. So
Yes.
anyway, that's what interested me about it. And there are, you know, anybody who's read Trungpa's book on Tibet, that he talks in detail how he led a group of 300 people out of Tibet after the Chinese invasions into India. And there are a number of times in that narrative where he says he didn't have any freaking idea where he was. And he simply did what I believe the word he uses is that he uses a divination. And learns in that, and he says the divination was done, and he doesn't tell exactly how it was done, but then he said we knew that we had to go in this direction or in that direction, and he managed to get them all out of Tibet and safely into India. Of course, he lost about half the group. You know, so there was a case of somebody who really had presumably a connection to that higher sense of being directed, which you also talked about at this. In this presentation.
Yes, yes, that's very well put. It reminds me of a story. I was at a press conference. Do you remember when there was a announcement about microbial life on Mars that was found in a meteorite that had landed here on Earth on a
I do remember that.
Yeah. ALH 8401, I think. And there was a lot of it's now been somewhat compromised and perhaps not seen as the major discovery that it was at that time. But NASA scientists were very, very excited about it. And I still remember there was a press conference that I went to, and there was one particular NASA scientist. Her name was Maria Zuber. She's at MIT. She's still a major presence at NASA. And she was fending off comments from the press. And they were asking her what they expected to discover next, what was going to be the next big thing, the next discovery. And she got a little annoyed and she said, well, if we knew what we were going to discover, it wouldn't be a discovery, would it? And I thought that summed it up in a nutshell, because often you don't know what you're looking for. And even when you find it, you don't know what it is exactly.
Yeah, that's quite remarkable, because what came to mind there was that Columbus didn't have any real idea of what he was getting into.
It's really
He simply went into the unknown.
yes.
I mean, he had some idea, and he had certainly a great deal of knowledge and experience and science behind him as it existed then, so that he figured that he could make his way accurately westward, but he
Right.
had no idea what was going to happen.
No, he
I
did.
mean, Dante thought you'd fall off the end of off the world, essentially. I mean, that's not true, of course, that you would go to the other side of the world and there would be the Mount of Purgatory.
Yes.
I mean, that's what they believed at the time.
Yeah, it's hard to know what Columbus, I mean, because he was sailing and he knew what happened to ships when they went over the horizon, which was that they just kept going because he saw ships, because he was a merchant seaman before he went, sinking below the horizon all the time. He didn't think that they were going to some, but wait, I take it back. On his third voyage, when he was north of Venezuela, he felt he was sailing upward suddenly, not on a sea, a wave, but sailing upward. And he also felt that he had discovered the entrance to paradise.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote it down on a map. So of course, other people, even in his time, took that as an example, the fact that he was losing his marbles. And but he was very convinced about it. But these mystical or extra, whatever you want to call it, rational convictions are really what drove him on. Without them, he would not have embarked on these voyages, because the greed alone was not enough.
Yeah, that's a very interesting dimension of it. Sure, right.
I think with Drake, it was the greed, the sense of greed and glory, but and he was more approachable and practical.
Well, the other interesting thing is that we do not have the direct narrative from their own minds, which is the whole thing about the epic, is that in an epic, you have the very broad organization of the consciousness that underwent these experiences. Whereas in the case of Marco Polo, it is a shame that he didn't write it himself.
Yes.
Because then you could say, all right, now we can pinpoint how his mind worked.
Yes.
And we can extrapolate forward and backward to some really concrete sense of why the hell he went and what happened concretely during the voyages or the travels.
Right. No, it's an as told to, but in a very, Rustichello actually makes up some stuff that he had saved from other epics he was writing that he added there as interpolations to show off or to flesh it out when he thought the quote real story was getting a little boring. So
right. Well, that brings up the question: was Rustichello familiar with the classical epics? Because those were stories all the way through,
Right. Well, he was in his time considered a kind of a second or third tier epic poet. So but no great shakes. I mean, he's best known for having happened to interview Marco Polo, or even share a cell. It's not clear exactly what happened at that point when they were in jail.
John, did you have a question?
You're muted, John.
John, you need to unmute yourself.
Sorry. Is that better?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. I live in a very different world than the world of an historian. I'm a Buddhist, and especially Tibetan Buddhist. And in the Tibetan Buddhist world, there are these myths if you call them myths, about a secret land called Shambhala. And Shambhala supposedly existed on Earth for some period of time and then rose above the Earth, and who knows where it lives today. There is a fellow who shares the same last name as I. His name is Ian Baker, who went to Nepal and got himself involved with some people and set out on a search, a voyage, you might say, of discovery to try and find what are called the Bayul. The Bayul are hidden lands, and they supposedly exist somewhere in the Himalayas, in areas where very few people have ever gone, especially Westerners. And there are 4 entrances to the Bayul, which are hidden. And the journey to find these entrances is both a spiritual and a geographic journey. And Ian set out to do it. And he wrote a book about it called The Heart of the World, which has been revised. He also has some marvelous videos and things that he did on YouTube. They're really extraordinary. The footage of places that most people don't see in the Himalayas. And he set out on a journey, and supposedly he just about found one of these entrances to the Bayul. He took a trip down the Yangtze River Gorge, which is the deepest river gorge in the world. It's in somewhere in Nepal, Bhutan. I'm not sure where he was exactly, but it's 4,000 feet deep. And he got to a point where his whole expedition was decimated and he couldn't continue, but he saw what he took to be the entrance to the Bayul across the river, but he couldn't reach it because his expedition was in tatters. So there are this is a different kind of exploration and adventure and kind of interesting, mythic, the secret lands of Shambhala. Supposedly, these lands are hidden, but the Shambhala myths, if you want to call them myths, predict that in about 250, 300 years, things are going to get worse and worse and worse on the planet. This is the Shambhala, and it's also the Great Perfection teachings say the same thing. And at that point, supposedly a terrible ruler is going to take control of the earth, and he's going to be a really evil person. And then he'll find out about Shambhala, and he'll start going after Shambhala, and this will rouse the Shambhalians, especially a mythic leader named Gesar of Ling. Gesar, Caesar, that word travels all across across Asia. And Gesar will rouse the armies of Shambhala and do battle with this evil person, defeat him, and usher in a golden age of 1,000 years of spiritual and cultural and physical well-being on the planet. And supposedly that one of the teachers, or more than one, who have told me about this prediction, have said that I and all the other people who are Buddhists and are studying all this stuff will be in those armies.
Oh.
So it was marvelous, really, Laurence. Thank you. It's just fascinating to listen to you, and I really thank you. And I feel like I want to go read one of your books. Where should one start reading? Do you have a recommendation?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think that the Magellan book, Over the Edge of the World, is probably the most popular. But from your perspective, Marco Polo might be the most interesting or relevant. And it just depends. My personal favorite among them is the book about NASA, Voyage to Mars, because that's really about exploration in all different kinds of aspects and scientific, and goes into some of the motivations of the NASA scientists who are much more imaginatively driven than you would imagine. That wasn't necessarily the most popular, but it was, for me, the most perhaps intellectually exciting one.
And it's called NASA Voyage to Mars?
It's just called Voyage to Mars.
Okay.
And it was published in, I think, 2000.
I know so little about Marco Polo, but there's one factoid that rattles around in my brain, and I don't know if it's true or not, which is that when he journeyed to China for wealth, currency, he took saffron because it was light and very, very valuable, much lighter and more portable than gold. Is that
Right.
true?
Well, yeah, herbs and spices were a medium of exchange then, and they were more valuable than gold, and lighter as well. So that was sort of astonishing. Cloves, cinnamon, all these things. When the Spice Islands, that was considered almost a El Dorado, only it was spices, not precious metals.
Wow. Thank you. It was a wonderful talk.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Larry,
Thanks.
thank you so much for joining us. It's been great.
Thanks
I don't
for
know if
having me.
anybody-
Appreciate
you
it.
can go.
Leap of faith on your part, and I really appreciate it. It was great.
It was not a leap of faith at all. I've heard you speak quite a few times, so thank you.
Thanks.
Anybody else
Mark.
have any comments?
I just wanted to say thank you.
Jane had her hand up earlier. You might want to ask her if she still has
Oh,
a
Jane.
question.
Jane, you're muted.
Jane, unmute yourself, please.
There you go. Okay, hi.
Hello.
I'm thinking about today and who are our current, what I'm going to call visionaries, the Jeff Bezos and the Elon Musks and the Steve Jobs and the people, the cosmologists, the physical scientists who are answering questions, Hawkins, whom we've lost recently, the big questions. That was Hawkins' last book, published posthumously. Where did we come from? When did the universe begin? What's out there? Is there a God? And science is attempting to answer that. And Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos are using their own money because they have, I believe, a vision of what's out there. And once we have a lot of the tools now scientifically to get these answers, and it's a very, very exciting prospect. And I want to know how you would compare our contemporary explorers, if we want to use that word, to these, 13th, 14th, 15th century explorations that you've researched and written about, because I didn't hear you talk about them having a vision of finding out the unknown as much as a specific goal, or God said do this, or the king or the queen or somebody said there's gold in their hills. Even Thomas Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark to explore what was north of the Missouri River, and then we'll get into the politics of the native peoples, etc. But these were visionaries. So how would you compare what's going on today in terms of exploration to all the research you've done and people you've written about?
I mean, it's leaving the planet, space is the next frontier. It has been for a while. And I think there'll be more and more of that. The problem or the challenge is that the distances are enormous, and there may be ways of getting around it or short-circuiting it, which we don't know about yet. But that's the greatest challenge. The Webb telescope, which you've probably heard about, is really the next big thing in exploration of any kind. It was launched a few months ago, but it's going to go on for years. It hasn't even gotten into its principal mission yet. It's going to go out 100 million miles into space, and it's going to be suspended in what's known as a Lagrange point. That was named after a French astronomer, Lagrange. And that means it will be, rather than moving around, it will be suspended about, actually 98 million miles or 90 million miles from Earth, it will collect light from, different sources, seen back to almost the beginning of the universe, which is extraordinary thought when you think about it, collecting them and then sending it back to Earth so that NASA can process it and other scientists be shared everywhere. So, this is an extraordinary thing. It's hard, it's difficult for people to, kind of wrap their minds around, at least for me anyway. I remember being at NASA about 10, 15 years ago, and part of the web was being constructed then. And the NASA scientists were patiently explaining it to me. In fact, I was with my daughter, who was then about 8 or 9. And I really didn't understand what they were talking about. Now, I get a better understanding of it, but I think I may be only half the way there, because I find, I don't know about you, that concepts in astronomy and physics are, anyway, for me, difficult to grasp because they aren't concrete. When you talk about ocean and mountains and, physical ordeals and all that, you can sort of get that. This is different. And of course, the distances, are beyond comprehension. But the web is it already has begun to change everything, but it's really just beginning. And the next major NASA mission, again, this is not directly Jeff Bezos, is called Da Vinci, and that's going to Venus, and that's going to be exploring Venus. It's about 7 or 8 years off, and the selling point for that is that understanding Venus for the first time will again change everything. Of course, first it has to succeed. First, it has to be a successful mission, and it has to get there, and it has to send signals back, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a significant failure rate, but the web looks like it's destined to succeed, and it's going to be extraordinary, and it's going to go on for the rest of our lifetimes. I mean, there's going to be new events all the time, new various findings that will be interpreted and reinterpreted for decades to come.
Yeah, it is a very, very exciting time. Well, I think, in this Hawkins book, he said that we don't know, we have the formulas and the ideas, but we don't have the mathematics, but we can invent a computer that can do the mathematics to answer these big questions. And I thought that's how we think. I don't know if that's Western or American or what, but that's how we think. And it's extraordinarily exciting to me.
Yes.
So thank you, because that was a great journey past, that really makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.
So thank you, Jane. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Larry, particularly, everyone else, for all your comments and for being here.
It's really a pleasure. It's just a wonderful group, very, very stimulating, enlightened, and thank you.
Larry, it was wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Pleasure.
Okay.
Great, thanks.
Oh.
Good
Thank
night,
you so much.
everybody. See you in the morning.
Thank you all. Thank you, Ellen,
Thank you, Larry. Thank you, everybody.
for introducing us to Laurence. Fabulous.
It's
Thanks,
nice.
Larry.
to meet you.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
So
Thank you.
much.
Ellen, thanks for all
Thank you,
your
Larry.
hard work to get for Larry here.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Bye. Hope to see you again. Bye.
Yeah, hold on. I'm going to put it into gallery. Thanks, everyone.
John, do you want to stop the recording, please?
Yeah.